All right, so, I mean, you have this kind of crazy CV, you worked on all this crazy stuff. Let's see, so the first question, let's just start at the top. What is your view on Vue's future? Like, how do you see it kind of fitting inside of the ecosystem? So you have these powerhouses like React and Angular and whatnot. How do you see Vue coexisting inside of this ecosystem?
So I think the first thing I want to say is I think the ecosystem is more healthy when you have like competing solutions, and in a sense, I don't even think it's a one solution all the other situation, but more like these different solutions definitely cover different target audience. Because the web space is really diverse, we have all kinds of different developers working on all kinds of different apps with different backgrounds. People coming from different backgrounds, the way they started web development kind of naturally puts them in a different mental model when they think about how they want to deal with building user interfaces. So, and I think it's important that we have these different opinions and choices for these different groups of people. So in that sense, there are definitely overlaps between these solutions, but I also feel like each of these mainstream solutions definitely deserve their own dedicated group of users. And I'm just happy that Vue is able to fill a gap I believe Vue has captured a group of users who are like not like 100% precise target audience of neither React nor Angular. I believe that's also why Vue is able to be where it is today, because in the beginning, when I started Vue, I had no intention of saying like, I want to compete with React or Angular. It just sort of grew naturally, organically, because people who just, they naturally felt to work with Vue, they feel it's more natural for them. So to answer the question, I think the future of Vue, I obviously hope it's going to continue to grow, but whether it's going to be more popular than React or Angular, honestly, I don't know. And I don't think it's necessary that I want to work towards that. That's not my goal. My goal is to serve the users who like Vue and make sure like they are more productive, they can build their apps faster and more efficiently. Yeah.
So I'm kind of a big fan of a lot of niche technologies, right? So Lisp and whatnot, and Reason. So there is a challenge, I think, whenever you have a smaller community to sustain it. There's a big social aspect to this, right? Versus kind of the inertia that maybe a bigger ecosystem has. So how do you maintain this community and actually keep it going, even at a small size?
So the thing is, we have, so Vue is an interesting case where it's, in its position as a framework, it sits between React and Angular in some sense. React is really community driven. A lot of innovations comes from people who are just excited to build things on top of React. Angular seems to be more a complete package where it sort of offers opinions and solutions to almost everything you can think of. And Vue kind of sits in between where we sort of carefully try to pick a sweet spot between pragmatism and leaving things that can be done in userland to the users. So we want to provide useful primitives, but we also want to do a bit more to cover more common use cases. Essentially, we are think of Vue as something that incorporates the React core on the same level, but we try to offer a thin layer on top of it to be a tiny bit more opinionated, but like allows you to opt in. And I think that's a healthy mix because we allow people who want more opinions to be productive from the get-go, but we also leave room for the community to sort of figure out their own way of doing things.
That makes a lot of sense. So whenever you were starting with Vue, were you focused a lot on the implementation? So for example, we have the React kind of popularized this idea of a virtual DOM and whatnot. Were you worried about the implementation or whatnot, or were you focused kind of purely on the abstractions and the API, kind of what you were presenting to your users?
I think it's a mix of both. In the beginning, the experiment really comes from two aspects. The first aspect is the first version of Vue was obviously inspired by Angular a lot, but from the API perspective, is really trying to strip out
all the things that I seem that's in the way for people getting started, and just try to expose the minimal amount of things you need to know to get something going on. So I think that's important for learning, important for getting people into web development, which is kind of a mission I sort of put into building this framework. And the other aspect of it was the internal implementation, the reactivity system, which was the internal was different from the way Angular did things. Angular used dirty checking back then, and Vue was essentially trying to take some of the ideas from Knockout and like Meteor Tracker and try to, but expose them via ES5 getters and setters so that it becomes sort of a little bit magical way of making things reactive, pretty much like MobX, what MobX is doing today. So that was the implementation part. I was just had this idea because back then we still had to support some older browsers, and I was like, what if we can just ditch IE8 and just use ES5 getters and setters? So that was kind of part of the intention of doing it.
Got it. For people who are kind of interested in the implementation layer, right? So there are consumers of your library who mainly focus on like API and ergonomics and whatnot. But if someone wants to kind of peek under the hood, how would you say the implementation of Vue kind of differs? And what's the guiding philosophy there?
So Vue has been rewritten like 2 times. So I would just talk about version 2 because I believe early versions were, old code. But the newer version, I guess it can. I would say the internal pieces are sort of I try to separate into different aspects. So the observer package is really just reactivity, making objects reactive, and also the part of code that tracks changes over time. Then there's the part which is responsible for rendering. It's forked off SnapDOM, which is a great library. We added Vue's component lifecycle on top of it and expanded its module system to add support for like things like transitions and other things. So for people who want to get into it, I think, so these are the 2 major chunks of things that people need to sort of know about, like how Vue's internal reactivity works and how Vue's the rendering layer, how the virtual DOM diffing happens. And if they want to go further, they probably should look at how, because Vue is also, the core is platform agnostic, and we kind of break out platform-specific code into like DOM-specific things is in the web package, and we also have a native runtime for the Weeks project. So we use different implementations for part of the, so we inject different runtime modules into the core virtual DOM patching algorithm for different platforms. So that's something interesting to look at as well.
Do you want to tell us kind of any specific differences in terms of if I can visualize how, say, for example, React's virtual DOM works and how Vue's internal implementation works? Is there any particular interesting differences between the 2?
So when you go down to the virtual DOM layer, it's mostly algorithmic differences, so it's probably just details. But on the higher level, there's an interesting distinction where Vue has this extra layer of templates. Right, and we have I should probably mention the 3rd biggest chunk of the code is the compiler that is responsible for compiling templates into virtual DOM the render function code. So in React we really just use the Babel plugin to transpile JSX into raw render function code. But in Vue it's a bit more involved because we have the full template syntax, and the template syntax was sort of evolved from version 1, which then kind of derives from Angular syntax. So there was a lot of, I would say there's some history burden in there, but we try to, in the version 2 rewrite, we try to make the syntax a bit more concise, a bit more coherent. And it turns out in the process, we realized there was a lot of interesting things we can do because we have this extra compilation step. So this kind of connects with some of the optimizations I talked about in yesterday's talk, in which we are able to like analyze static trees by default, optimize some of the diffing, skip things that we didn't need to do because we have more static information at compile time. A lot of these things we can just do it transparently without the user even knowing about it, and then on top of that we also expanded on the template idea even further, we have this single file component format, which is also really just a source format for compilation. So when you co-locate more about your components into the same file, the compiler gets more information and the compiler can do more. So that's kind of the interesting distinction when, we realized after we did it. Yeah.
So there's a bunch of, obviously there's been a big movement in terms of moving things over to kind of static analysis and compilation and whatnot in the JavaScript community. I'm curious, do you enjoy working at that layer, or do you mainly focus on the product in terms of like, that's what excites you to be able to deliver this library that everyone uses, or do you enjoy kind of geeking out and being able to apply all these optimizations at the static compilation step?
I think I enjoy both. I think it's, because being able to, I think for a library to succeed, both aspects are really important. You want to have a streamlined package that people would enjoy using, but you also want to have great internals that you can promise that it's going to be robust, it's going to be performant, it's going to be giving you the same defaults and kind of prevent you from doing things wrong. So like that's why I get to keep on working on it for so long, because we still have a long list of things that we want to implement, and I think that's exciting. So I think I kind of work in cycles. Sometimes I just dedicate to improve the API for a while. Then I'm like, now it's time to go back to the down level and try to optimize things. So both are equally interesting.
Very nice. So along those lines, you kind of talked about the migration from version 1 to version 2. You can work at the API level and the implementation level. Any plans you want to share with us for version 3?
Right. So there was a brief mention of version 3 a while ago, but after that we discussed a little bit and concluded that it should not really be called version 3, but rather we want to label it as with an extra like -next label. So the main idea is we want to swap out the current implementation, the reactivity system, which is based on ES5 getters and setters, to leverage ES 2015 proxies. And at the same time, because proxies basically demands the browser having native ES 2015 support, so in the process we're going to essentially drop support for all the browsers that does not natively support ES 2015 and leverage all the latest features, like we can finally use map and set in our code base. So that's going to essentially clean up the code base a bit and gets rid of some of the current limitations of ES5 implementation in our reactivity system. So it's going to be really partially internal code base improvement and also a public quality of life improvements. There's also going to be some performance improvements for certain cases, but we still need to measure and benchmark that to be more precise. But for the public API, it's not going to change. We try our best to try to keep it completely the same. There are going to be there is going to be one small tiny breaking change that we know for sure it's going to happen, but it's probably not going to affect, like 99% users will not run into it. That's why we were labeling it as 2.x next, and it's going to be basically 2 parallel branches that's maintained alongside each other, and we just cherry pick features, because the nice thing is this refactoring really doesn't affect the feature layer that much. It's just the internals. And most of our feature layer code will remain exactly the same. The public API is going to be the same. So we believe for the majority of the users, if they are able to drop IE, then they should just be able to move over to the new version with minimal effort, which was why we believe it should not be called 3.0 at all. So currently, honestly, there's really no plan for 3.0 in the short term, because we don't really see enough intentions to do breaking API changes. Well, we have a few things we want to change, but it's probably not worth the whole breaking release yet.
How do you balance, so for example, React Fiber was released, and they had to go through a lot of effort to make sure that they didn't break this public API while they were doing this massive refactoring of the underlying implementation. How do you balance these concerns? So you're saying that you already have one small breaking change, but largely you want to maintain this public API. Yeah. How do you actually achieve that without accidentally breaking one of your users' case?
So yeah, it is extremely hard to balance. Like even in minor releases, we sometimes still unexpectedly break people's things. But the baseline is we make sure our all documented public API works consistently, and that's kind of covered by the test suites and stuff. So unfortunately, in a lot of the internal behavior, for example, we don't have a synthetic event system. So sometimes, like when we adjust the way we handle events, people who rely on some really low-level details of how the DOM behaves will run into problems. But unfortunately, that's just like, that happens when people rely on things that's not part of a public API, and it's really hard to make a super strict guarantee about that. But we try our best to minimize such cases, and we label them as regressions and try to fix them. In the long run, so for the next version, we consider that breaking change to be a worthwhile trade-off because it's really small enough and people rarely would actually run into it, but in return we get a lot of benefits. So we believe that's a worthwhile trade-off, and we would only make such trade-offs if the benefit greatly outweighs the drawback.
So there's a question here about, is the motivation for moving to TypeScript, is that generally driven by compiling optimization concerns, or are there other reasons? So there's a concern, for example, to transit to using TypeScript. Is there, what would be the motivation for that?
Compiling optimization is a concern for you to transit to using TypeScript. Well, we're not technically transiting to TypeScript. We're just improving TypeScript support because we believe TypeScript is great for the users who like static typing. So we want to make sure users who want to use both Vue and TypeScript get the optimal experience out of it. But TypeScript itself really has little to do with how Vue optimizes things internally. So I'm not sure if that question is actually...
No, I think that makes sense. The idea is that this is an end-user ergonomic issue rather than an implementation detail,
exactly.
Right? Yeah. So have you tried out Facebook's pre-pack yet? Or have you heard of it? Any thoughts on it?
So yeah, I've played with it a little bit. So essentially, but that was when it was first announced. I haven't been closely following up how it has been progressing, but my initial impression is it does a lot of cool things in certain places, but it also has some places where loop unrolling sometimes is just undesirable, makes the code actually much larger. At that time there wasn't a configurable options to say I just want to disable this specific behavior. So our initial impression is this is cool, but it's probably not ready for production yet. But it's definitely interesting, and we'll keep watching it.
Just in general, I mean, with tools like Babel and whatnot, have you explored the space of, obviously with the compiler, the kinds of optimizations you can do ahead of time with evaluating ahead of time and whatnot?
That's a very interesting question. Unfortunately not, because Babel doesn't really afford that capability. There's no partial evaluation that's made possible via Babel in a way. So a prepack is able to do that, I believe, due to the way it is specifically architectured to do flow-based partial evaluation. Similar to how Flow infers types by kind of making assumptions about that, but I don't think these tools expose easy enough to use primitives for tooling to be built on top of that. But I'd be curious if there's something like that available. Yeah.
So, with tools like Babel and whatnot, and implementing templating languages and whatnot, it takes a lot of effort to kind of add a library like this. What are your thoughts on kind of a general AST transformation? So something like macro systems, Sweet.js, that kind of thing. How would that, if that was available, how would that change your implementation, your usage, and ergonomics of Vue?
Could you repeat that question again?
Yeah, sure. So imagine that JavaScript had macros. How would that change either the implementation or the ergonomics of Vue?
If JavaScript had macros, but the macros, how would that be different from, say, a Babel plugin?
Yeah, so Babel plugins right now are kind of approaching, I think, macros, right? So imagine this was built into the language.
Right.
So right now, I think to add, for example, a templating language requires a lot of effort.
Yeah.
If you're able to do, say, a generalized AST transformation at the library level, would that be a useful thing for the JavaScript ecosystem, or do you think that power is slightly maybe more dangerous than useful?
I honestly believe it's going to be super dangerous. The way the JavaScript ecosystem is right now is like we already have enough crazy ideas, given that the language itself doesn't have macros. And I think it's a good thing that the way of experimenting with language level features is separated into a tool chain that's separate from the language itself. I personally hope we don't actually have macros in JavaScript.
Fair enough. So there's some questions about, so for example, React 16 has the fiber reconciliation. They've done a lot of work to kind of optimize and be able to assign priorities to certain updates and whatnot. Is there equivalent work being done on the Vue side of things?
So we don't have a strict fiber equivalent, but the interesting thing is Vue already, the way Vue's updates work is we already do a similar style of, we push each component's update job as a unit of work into a scheduler. So we had that concept like from starting 2.0, but we never really leveraged that much aside from making sure the components are updated in the correct order in cascading sequence. But Fiber really gave us some ideas about how we can actually like leverage what we already have and try to simulate what Fiber does in some cases. It's not going to be exactly the same with Fibers, but the thing is, the biggest change about Fiber is it turned it into a deep stack call into something that, a flat queue that you can sort of rearrange and prioritize. In Vue, we already had this like queue-like structure that's in place. We just never actually did anything about it aside from making sure that the order is correct. But we're really interested in watching we're expecting to see more like real-world use cases where Fiber provides interesting like real-world use cases, and we hope to analyze it a bit better to move before we actually move to pick some of the great ideas from that into our current system.
Yeah, kind of on that theme of taking the best and learning from other people. Is there going to be kind of an equivalent of, say, Glimmer's opcode approach in Vue's implementation?
That's a great question. I was actually talking with Tom Dale yesterday, and we're just like thinking out loud, and I had this idea of directly compile. So opcodes are essentially an even lower level abstraction for the way you interact with DOM. So currently, virtual DOM is sort of a layer in between, and when you perform the virtual DOM diffin, eventually what you actually produce is the exact sequence of operations you want to actually perform. So we can think of the diffin pass as a runtime computation that produces runtime opcodes, but at the same time, your template can also be directly compiled into static opcodes. So, so there could be it's probably going to be pretty messy if we like just slap it on top of what Vue is doing right now. But it's technically possible for us to do something like you have the source template; it can compile directly into opcodes, and then for people who want to drop down to the render function layer and directly write render functions, which is a feature we definitely want to preserve because we believe it's valuable. Those would just produce opcodes in runtime, and both just talk to the lowest level, the Glimmer VM or equivalent that handles the opcodes. And the great thing about opcodes is that they can essentially be a format that's really easy to parse and transfer over the network, which is super efficient, and also is a great format when we want to leverage the computing power of WebAssembly and then let the WebAssembly talk to the main thread. Because WebAssembly cannot touch the DOM, so we need a very compact, efficient format for us to sort of talking back and forth, transferring these like DOM operations So that's some interesting area, and the Glimmer team is actually exploring some really interesting ideas, and we have this idea of, maybe one day we can leverage a common format so that all the frameworks can somewhat leverage that thing as a standardized interface to let WebAssembly talk to the main thread to touch the DOM.
Oh, very interesting. There was one more, I think, interesting question to end on, perhaps, which was, do you see kind of any shortcomings in the compile time optimization or static tooling in the JavaScript ecosystem right now? So things like Babel and other things. If so, like, what should the community be working on to improve these kinds of toolings?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a shortcoming. I wouldn't say there are like very obvious shortcomings. Maybe there should be more documentation onto how to properly write a Babel plugin, or the other thing we mentioned earlier about, if the tool actually lets you have some way to do partial evaluation of things. Essentially, Babel currently, pure static analysis can be useful, but it obviously has limitations on how much information you can infer from just static semantics. Runtime semantics, currently there's nothing we can do about it, but tools like Flow and Prepack already is going into that territory, and it would be interesting to see how such capabilities can be exposed to the wider developer community so that we can leverage that to build even more interesting stuff on top of it. Yeah.
Super interesting. Thank you very much. Please give it up for Evan.
Thank you.